We're going to have to like set some boundaries and reclaim our power. I think that like that
Yeah.
is I think that comes up in parenting. It comes up in the way you and I talk about politics and being a citizen in this podcast, right? Which is like, it all starts with a sense of agency and like who I am, what I want, this self connection, right?
All right. I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independence Center and a former marketing professor.
I'm Lauren Hall, professor of political science and author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life.
This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power.
We talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens, drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, and as parents.
Welcome. We have a really special one-on-one. Laura and I are doing a solo. Well, I don't know, not solo, but like we're all on our own today because a huge theme of this podcast is the toxicity of politics. And we wanted to dig into that a little bit in terms of like what advice we would give our best friend in this situation. So Laura, kick us off. What are we doing today? Well, so we've been kind of playing with this relationship metaphor. And it came up in our podcast recently with Lee Drutman, where Lauren, you said to him, why can we not get out of this abusive relationship that we are stuck in? And it was kind of playful and funny because on one hand, like if you start digging into all the different relationship metaphors, like they just flow, it works really well. And we also talk, though, in a really serious way in this podcast about what would it look like if politics was more about relationship and less about power. So I think there's kind of like a lighthearted aspect to this and a playful one, as well as a more serious one. But we thought it'd be fun to kind of explore these metaphors and think about what they could tell us about what's going wrong in politics and therefore how you could get it back on track. But do you want to just kind of start with like when you asked Lee the question about what are we doing in this abusive relationship? Like, what did you have in mind? What did that bring up?
So it's funny. I was actually on Bruce Chalmers' podcast a couple months ago, and he and his wife are couples therapists, and so we had actually been talking about sort of radical moderation and sort of looking at the parallels between politics and relationships. But I hadn't really dug into it in like a deeply meaningful way. And other than the fact that that's, as you say, that's a major theme of this particular podcast is relationships broadly. But I had not actually dug into like how deep the parallels go in terms of the kinds of warning signs, right? Red flags, like people talk, like that's like a big thing on social media now, right? Like red flags. And what are the red flags in political relationships? And it turns out that they're like pretty much the same as the red flags in interpersonal relationships, like a lot of the same kinds of patterns that we see. And I think we're going to talk about a couple like big themes this episode. We're going to talk about gaslighting. We're going to talk about narcissism. We're going to talk about isolation and love bombing and trauma bonding. But let's just start with gaslighting. I mean, I think this is like one of those like I talk a lot about how the political binary actually changes our perception of the world. Like it changes our perception of political and policy problems. And so, I don't know if you want to define gaslighting for us, and then we can kind of dig in a little bit in terms of how we see that in the political realm.
Yeah, and maybe we should have started this with disclaimers that we are not, we're not clinical psychologists. My training is academic. I am not a practitioner. We are not giving actual relationship advice. So
No.
Yeah, there you go. Obligatory disclaimer.
Yes. Please don't take anything that we say here and apply it to your personal life other than rethinking your relationship with your political party. I think That's a
There you go.
safe,
That's safe.
that's a safe
We are
application.
qualified to advise on that. But yeah, gaslighting, I think, has just taken off in popularity in the past few years. Everybody's saying it, but it's basically saying like what you perceive and feel as reality is not correct. And it's often accompanied by sort of this like assertion that like my view is the one that's actually correct. And here it is. And my feeling after the last election and why Democrats did poorly, underperformed, was that they were basically gaslighting voters about the economy. And so if you have two choices, right? If you are saying, hey, I feel like I don't have enough money, and that's what voters were telling pollsters with their top concern over and over and over. And so if you tell somebody, I feel like I don't have enough money, and their answer is, yes, you do. We have some charts that show that the economy's fine, right? That's actually a form of gaslighting. It's very demotivating, right? Because like action is tied to your understanding of the world. So if I tell you you don't actually understand the world at all, you're just kind of like, oh, okay, guess I'll sit out, right? So I think that actually probably depressed some turnout for Democrats. And then in contrast, you had Republicans saying, yeah, the economy is bad and we're going to do something about it, which is a lot more motivating. So I think that was like textbook gaslighting, but I think we kind of continue to see it in the political discourse. And maybe polarization also is involving some gaslighting. Is that how you look at it, Lauren?
Yeah. So, and I'll say too, the gaslighting and actually all of these things we're going to talk about, I think sometimes we think about like abusive relationships as though the person has to be like intentionally trying to do this. Like they have to like mean to gaslight you. And that's actually not true. Like gaslighting can often be, it's like a defensive mechanism that people use. I think there's reasons that like the Democrats thought they had reasons to downplay the economy. I mean, they had reasons sort of internally, obviously, to downplay like economic. But I think their argument was, well, the broad economic indicators are good, so like we can sort of ignore these other kinds of problems. And I was reminded when you gave that example of we're working on some like cognitive behavioral therapy with my my kid with big emotions, and one of the things that like parenting relationships often, or like parenting relationship therapists often talk about, is the need to validate people's emotions and their experiences, even if you think that they are not accurate, right? And so the Democrats took this like hyper rational, and it is a form of gaslighting, right? They're like, your experience isn't real. Your experience of the economy isn't actually true, right? We have all these charts to show, right? As you pointed out, when what would have made a lot more sense is to do what you should do with like your kid when they're upset, which is to say, hey, I totally get that you're upset right now. I get that you're feeling all these big emotions. Those emotions are like emotions themselves are 100% fine. Let's dig into why you're feeling those emotions and then figure out how we need to navigate it, because you got to put your shoes on and you got to go to school. Like, we got to get to this.
Here are the realities, right? Like, here's what we have to deal with. I understand where you're coming from, though.
Right. But parents sometimes do gaslight their kids because they're just like exhausted, right? They're like, you are not that upset. Get out the door, right? Like, and so I think it's not always like this like nefarious kind of form of manipulation, but I think it's really clear that like the Democrats did not they didn't validate voter concerns in a meaningful way. And now, of course, we're seeing it on the other side. I mean, like the arguments that like, that like Chicago and Portland are just like cesspools of violence, and like everyone, like it's just like they've fallen into the ninth circle of hell, and we need to send in the National Guard and ICE agents. Like that's like a very clear form of gaslighting, right? Like your reality doesn't match the reality around you, and it's easier to do in this hyper polarized world because it's easy to convince rural voters that cities are just cesspools, like I'm half the country away from Chicago, so how would I know, right? So I do think that that's a real, and it is powerful, right? Because and actually you can speak to this more than I can, but like there's also a kind of, we have this propensity to trust people that we love, and we also have this propensity to trust people in positions of authority. So when someone says like the city of Chicago is, right.
burning down, um, that's a person in authority. So if you don't have a reason to distrust them, it's
Mm-hmm.
easy to get swept up in that kind of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think now with polarization, it's almost like, well, I know this is true because a leader from my side said it's true. And I know it's not true if a leader from the other side said it's
Yeah.
true. And I think the only real answer is to talk to people in Chicago and say,
Yeah.
what is it like for you there? And, when I ask people the, National Guard on the ground started in Washington, D.C. And when I ask people who live in Washington, like, what has that been like for you? What do you think about it? I get a mixed bag. I hear people who say, like, I felt really unsafe lately. There have been some really scary things happening. Um, I'm kind of glad to see them. I've heard people say the complete opposite, but I
Yeah.
feel a lot better relying on their word for it. And I feel like, you know, we at the Independent Center, we work with this pollster. His name's Brett Lloyd. His polling group is called the Bullfinch Group. He does great work for us. And he always says, like, when people are like, how do we know if voters are independent? Or how do we know if they're right about these? His line is always, well, why don't we just ask them? Right? Like, why don't we just trust them when they tell us? And so that's how I think about this on the ground. Like, this is the antidote to gaslighting, right? Is like, why don't I just ask the people that I'm interested in knowing about and take their word for it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, and that is absolutely true, right? Like, one of the things that people recommend, and one of the things too, and then we can talk about this in terms of polarization, because one of the things that makes gaslighting effective is isolation. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you can't check your reality against other people's reality, then it becomes really easy to fall victim to this kind of thinking, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you're not able to reach out to your friend, if you've been cut off from your family because they voted for the wrong party, right? Like, in whatever election, then it is a lot harder to, like, be like, wait, what is actually
Right.
the truth? And because we've sorted ourselves, right? We've talked about this before on the podcast, that, like, demographic sorting, the fact that people now live in communities
Mm-hmm.
that they tend to, right? They live in workplaces increasingly that are sorted by sort of rough political affiliation. That's true of the kinds of communities that people choose to live in. It's even harder to get that kind of reality check.
Mm-hmm.
And, I talk about sort of breaking through binaries by doing this sort of four-dimensional, right? And a lot of that is like getting onto the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But to get back to your point, I mean, I do think that and I actually see, I think I've been guilty of this too. But I remember reading, like, a New York Times article that was talking about subway violence in New York City. And they were talking about people being pushed onto the tracks, right,
Mm-hmm.
on subways. And so they started, or like the overall tone of the article was like, this really isn't a big deal because it's very, very rare. You're more likely to get hit by lightning than you are to be pushed onto the subway tracks. And I'm like, okay, we make that argument about, like, parenting decisions, right? Like, you need to understand what the actual risk of something is.
Mhm.
But still, being pushed onto subway tracks is, like, a very scary thing. And the
Mhm.
fact that there is a decent amount of crime in, like, subways in general in New York City, like, it's not to say that, like, people's experience of fear in the subway is accurate, an
Mhm.
accurate reflection of risk, but to totally invalidate the conversation, I think
Mhm.
is a real problem. And that's how you get separated from voters. Like, that's how voters stop paying attention to you. And they had a quote from one of the guys who actually survived being pushed onto subway tracks. And he said, I'm like, he's super progressive, has lived in, New York his whole life, loves the city. Um, and he said at the end, he's like, I mean, I get the data, I understand, but it
Mhm.
also feels really dismissive to be
Mhm.
pushed onto a subway track, almost die, spend, like, months in a
Mhm.
hospital and have to relearn how to walk again, and then have people say that, like, this isn't a big deal. And so, like, I
Mhm.
think there's this complexity and nuance that this the sort of the binary thinking that, like, this kind of political abuse, which is what
Political. I love that.
it encourages us to think in terms of these binaries that, like, it eradicates all the nuance. Like,
Mhm.
you should be able to, it should be able to be true that being pushed onto subway tracks is a deeply scary thing.
Mhm.
It's also rare. And we should also figure out how to make people feel safe on
Mhm.
subways.
Yeah.
Like, that, all of those things can be true at the same
They can
time.
all be accomplished, right?
Um, I think it's interesting because I think like what I'm hearing you say about this particular case reminds me of how people think about parenting and politics too, to some extent, right? Which is like, if you take their version of reality seriously and you therefore conform your behavior to whatever this person is feeling, isn't that kind of delusional? Right. And so this is where I think you're saying like there's balance and nuance, which
Yeah.
is you can go to voters and say, well, you tell me what the blocks in your life are to you living your life the way you want. You tell me where the blocks are. You tell me where the problems are and let me see what I can come up with. It doesn't mean that we have, mobs of voters with pitchforks and we just do whatever the mob
Right.
wants. It means we take that information and then we say, okay, if this is a problem, right? If subway safety is a problem, then what do we do about it? And what are the trade-offs with whatever course of action that we pick, right? And how do we do something smart? So it's not saying like the entire process from start to end is led, directed, governed by emotion. It's just saying the emotion contains some information, right? Like there's both mixed up and we should attend to it. And also, if we don't, things will get unhealthy and weird, which I think is, we were kind of joking that the shutdown is like stonewalling in a relationship, right? Like you have the two parties that have shut down the government and they're like, fine, you won't do what I want. I'm not doing what you want. I'm just not going to talk or do anything, right? Like if you've ever been in a relationship with like that, like that's really unhealthy. Things will get weird. And it's the same with voters, right? Like if you're just like, no, we're not listening to you. We're cutting off all the mechanisms by which you could tell us what you think. That's deeply unhealthy. And we see that, right? Like that's what gerrymandering does. It disenfranchises moderate voters. That is what refusing to have town halls does, right? It says like, no, there's no feedback channel for you here. I'm not listening to you. I'm deciding. Just all these different steps by which voters can no longer make their views heard, right? You have primaries that have an architecture that makes it so that the most extreme candidate wins. You have House seats, especially that are just do not turn over. I forget what the number of them are that's actually in play in a given election. It's a tiny, tiny fraction. So like this is how voters would get to make themselves heard. And yet the other party in this relationship, which happens to be a political party, is just sort of saying like, nope, not going to listen, which is infuriating. And, voters are angry and they're being told to channel that anger to the other political party when I think there's a real argument that the person to be angry about is the one that they're in a political relationship with, which is their own party.
Yeah.
So one of the things too that the conversation about sort of gaslighting reminded me of too is sort of the general sort of pattern of power and control that we see in sort of abusive relationships, broadly speaking. And sort of our tagline on this podcast is right, how to make politics less about or more about, flourishing in relationships and less about power and control. And one of the things that we see, and this example, I think we've been playing with this sort of these two extremes that we see. And I think either party tends to fall more into one extreme than another. And this came up in the Lee Drutman episode too. I think Democrats have a tendency to sort of dismiss fears, right? Like your fears are not valid because data, right? So like, here's all these reasons that like immigrants are not going to steal your jobs. You're not going to get pushed onto subway tracks. Like violent crime across the board has been declining. Like, so Democrats have all this data. Libertarians do this too. I think like hyper rationalistic, sort of, and I'm as an academic, I think like that's our like modus operandi, right? Like, your fears are not valid because of data. But it's a really important call for me because like I think that is actually really problematic when you're dealing with human beings and you're dealing with humans who they have to make decisions in like an emotive environment. But then the flip side of that, and this is where I think we see like the sort of abuse on two different levels. The flip side of that is what the MAGA movement has done, which is they have sort of reacted to this dismissal of fears. And just they work to activate fear, right? Their entire sort of campaign is to activate fear. And you and I have talked about this a lot. It's really easy to activate fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy. Fear activates tribalism. So they know that this is a vicious cycle that they can take advantage of. But when you have when you're able to activate fear in that way, and we're seeing that with, in the 2016 election, it was fear around immigrants and violence, which of course we know from the data is not accurate. But if you are living in like a high crime city, it's not okay to just say like, your experience isn't valid because nationwide violent crime has been, going down. Like that's not useful to the people who are living in it in the moment. But then the second piece of that is like the sort of being able to activate the fear response when it comes to the sort of like isolation, right? Like you need me, AKA the Republican Party, because the Democrats are dangerous, their policies are dangerous, urban areas are dangerous, right? You need us to control all these dangerous things because otherwise the country will fall apart. And so we have these kinds of like these two political parties that have taken really different strategies, and both are actually forms of like abusive control in different ways. And so I think that's actually really illuminating, and trying to think about how to avoid those extremes. Like you don't want to say to people, your fears aren't valid, but you also don't want to say, like, you don't want to activate people's fear responses. Like you don't want to make them more afraid than they already are. What you want to do is try to figure out how to help them navigate, like, what are some ways that we can make people feel more safe? What are ways that we can reduce, even if violent crime's been going down, there's hot spots. I live in an area where downtown Rochester, I'm very safe 5 miles away from downtown Rochester, but downtown Rochester has a lot of violent crime. And it's unfair for me to say to people who live in downtown Rochester, like, well, you'll be fine because violent crime is going down. Like, what a weird thing to say. Like, right. So I think that those extremes are kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think, what I hear this from both parties, right? And I think what they are saying to voters is hand your agency over to us because we will have to fix it for you, right? So it's like, trust us, give us your power, we will fix it. Whereas the more empowering thing to say to voters would be to say, tell me what your reality is, tell me what you need, and let me help you be in control of this. Let me help you respond in the way that makes sense to you. And that actually, ironically, is very much like how I think we both parent, right? Which is like, I don't have a set of rules that dictate how my kids behave. My parenting is more centered on, for better or worse, like, believe me, we have some struggles, but my parenting is more centered on, I want to understand your values. Let's understand them together. And then let's figure out how you move through the world in a way that is centered on those values. Right. And that's handing the control to them. That's, I'm hoping, training them to be deeply empowered. But I don't actually think I don't think the political parties want voters who are deeply empowered.
No, and this actually goes to something you've written on before, which is narcissism. So like narcissism, which is also huge on social media, right? Yeah, red flag. But political narcissism, right? So you've written on sort of both personal and political narcissism. And I think this is directly related to that point you just made. So how do you see political narcissism or how do you think about what that means?
Yeah, so I know narcissism has like a textbook definition or clinical definition that I am not super familiar with because I'm not a clinician. But I think about narcissism in terms of like, is there exchange within the relationship or not? Right. And so where there's no exchange, where there's no balance, to me, that is narcissism, right? Because it's like one person believes within that relationship that all of the relational resources go their direction and they don't owe anything back. And this is actually violating the fundamental rule of all relationships, which is reciprocity, right? Like the golden rule, do unto others. You can't violate that for very long without destroying the relationship. And what I've written in the past, actually, I've talked about narcissism in workplace relationships. I've talked about narcissism in political relationships. And they both have the same thing, which is we are going to expect employees, or voters to give a lot, give loyalty, give money, give support, give all of these things, but we don't have any reciprocal obligation to the voter or to the employee. And I think that is really deeply unhealthy. That's exploitative of the voter or the employee, right? And it's really unhealthy, but yet we've really normalized it too, right? Because like, I mean, I think a lot of workplaces are like, oh, we're a family here. But they don't mean that they're going to like bring you a casserole when you have a baby or if somebody dies in your family. They mean you behave like this is a family. I'm excluded from that. And to me, like that is a form of narcissism and we should be calling it out, right? Like if I send you to Washington to represent my district, don't you owe me some things? Don't you owe me at least hearing me?
Mhm. Yeah. So, when I think about sort of the textbook definition of narcissism, right, it's sort of people who think that the world sort of revolves around them and therefore other people are tools, right?
Mhm.
And what better describes the two main political parties, right, than the fact that voters are tools that they
Right.
use to achieve their ends? There are exceptions, right? There are some really good
Right. Of
representatives
course.
out there. There's like really good people working. And I think those people are fighting an uphill battle and they get burnt out real hard because right now the institutional incentives they just point toward narcissism, right? Like
Right.
you have to serve the party, you have to serve the needs of the party. It's not about the party serving voters. It's about the voters, right? Like how do we capitalize on voter turnout and voter fear and voter anger to serve the party, right? Um,
Can I
and
just
so what
add
that
one
means,
thing?
yeah,
I
yeah,
was
yeah.
going to say it's not just voters who are getting that treatment. If you talk to members of Congress, they will tell you that they also, within the party machine and party leadership, they are also, there's this exploitative, extractive type relationship as well where they owe stuff. So
Mhm.
apparently it exists at more than one level.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And if you look at some of the research on like what politics has turned into, like there's a lot of people doing really good work on trying to sort of get better people into office. But the problem isn't necessarily sort of getting better people into office. It's like why would you want to run in the first
Hmm.
place? And when you get in, why would you stay? Right?
Hmm.
There was a recent uh statistic that senators spend about 70% of their time fundraising.
Yeah.
Like they're not meeting with their constituents, they're
No.
not problem solving, they're not working across across the aisle to solve real problems. They are serving the party machine, right?
Yeah, that
So you're
fundraising isn't for themselves, to clarify.
it's
It is
yeah,
for other candidates and for the party.
yeah. So I think you're absolutely right to point out that like it's not just voters who are sucked into this like narcissistic
Mhm.
cycle, right? It's the good people who are
Mhm.
trying to serve their communities, right? They get burnt out. Like why would they bother, right?
Mhm.
And so you lose really good people really quickly.
Yeah.
Um and this goes to sort of that broader problem that you and I have both pointed out with the current two-party system, which is it's not about making like it's not about making lives better for people. It's not about
Right.
solving actual problems. It's, we could solve the immigration problem. Like, and I mean, solve in the sense that, like, we could find a meaningful solution that balances different needs and protects people from abuse and harm. Like,
Mhm.
lots
We
of
we we
people
absolutely could. There are
have,
really
like,
good
it's
plans
been
out there.
written down.
There
Yeah.
there's
Um,
legislation that's been drafted with signees from co-sponsors from both parties. That stuff is real. It exists in the world.
yeah. Yeah. But solving problems doesn't serve the parties. It doesn't
Mhm.
serve the party machine or the party interests. And so of course we're not going to get those solutions. And so it's so abusive when you look at it in that
Mhm.
vein of the fact that like we are all just tools in this system. Um and we're kept there. Actually, we should maybe this is a good time to switch into like how we are kept in this
Mhm.
cycle, right? Like what are some of the patterns that we see?
Mhm.
You and I had sort of chatted a little bit about like trauma bonding, but like, what do
Mhm.
we like? Where do we see trauma bonding? And actually, the Independence Center would be like a great like a lot of your research is kind of on like why are we trauma bonded to like the two
Yes.
parties? Like, what is it that we?
That's such a
Yeah,
funny phrase. Um,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's, probably you only see the thing that the parties say. My guess is you only see this in very rare instances in interpersonal relationships, right? But because it's pretty toxic, right? What the parties say is like, well, they will never love you. They're terrible, right? Like looking at the other
Mhm.
party,
Yeah.
exactly. They don't want you. They're horrible. You don't want them. You can't go anywhere else, right? And I
Mhm.
think that's when you only have two parties, that's really effective to just be like, well, you
Yep.
may not like me, but there's nothing else in the world for you.
Well, and it's even gotten more explicit, right? It's not just like they don't love you, it's they're dangerous. They wanna hurt
Mhm.
you, right? So
Right.
it
So it's
is
like
that like
I'm gonna hurt you, but they would hurt you worse, right?
yeah, yeah,
I'm the only
yeah,
one taking care of you. This is yeah.
and I'm hurting you in order to protect you. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Um, so what are some like, yeah, what are some ways that uh, trauma bonds operate? Like, what do we know about the psychology of? And this again goes to, like for those of
Mhm.
you who have joined, we are not clinical psychologists.
We're not
Any
giving any
stretch.
advice about
This is
relationships.
not, yeah, this is not advice. But like, what are the mechanisms that keep it going? I mean, obviously,
Mhm.
fear and control are two obvious ones. But like, how, why do people stay in relationships with, for example, two parties that make their lives miserable?
Yeah, I think this just kind of goes back to our desire for familiarity and a sense of mastery. So even when something is miserable, we can adapt to it. It becomes under it predictable and therefore more appealing than something unknown. Amanda Ripley has this book before her high conflict book. She wrote a book called The Unthinkable that's really interesting, and it's about how people respond to disasters, and she did such a good job of providing like an embodied description of what this looks like. She talked about um, ship, a passenger ship. I can't remember the details now of it exactly, but it began to sink and it was listed at a really severe angle. They needed to evacuate people off of the boat. And the survivors were describing people climbing uphill through through the bar of the ship to get to the bar to continue to order drinks, right? And it was sort of like what happened is when something often awful happens, your brain acclimates and says, well, this is life now. It's like the dog with the flames around it saying, this is fine. That is how we move through the world. So once you kind of acclimated to this horrible party that's treating you terribly, and you are being told that the other party is worse, is an existential threat, like it makes complete sense that you would be like, well, I guess this is fine.
Hmm.
Instead of being like, I'm not gonna accept this. Um,
Hmm.
and I think this is where you kind of get back to like in our parenting choices, right? Like what I always think of, like I have one daughter, I know you have three. When I think about like what is the kind of woman that I want my daughter to grow up and be, I want her to be the kind of woman who grows up and when somebody treats her badly, she goes, that's strange. I don't get treated like that.
Yeah.
And then leaves. Right. And like,
Hmm.
shouldn't we want voters to do that? That's kind of what I want.
Hmm.
I want voters to look around and be like, that's strange. Goodbye.
Hmm.
Right. And
Hmm.
like, vote for somebody else. Cross party lines, vote third party. Right. But just kind of remove yourself from the relationship. But it does start with this like baseline piece, which is I deserve reciprocity. I deserve fair treatment. I deserve to be heard.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's another piece of this too, which is just looking at sort of like attachment theory in human
Hmm.
beings and like how humans become attached to other people and why people. I mean, this is like the big question for why do people who are in abusive relationships stay? That's
Hmm.
always the question. And there's lots and lots of complicated
Right.
reasons why people stay. But one of them is this idea of intermittent reinforcement. And
Hmm.
so when you get when a positive thing, so if you get a lot of positive things, you just get used to
Right.
that sort of positive stuff.
Yeah.
If you have a lot of negative stuff, you get really used to a lot of negative stuff, and you might actually just decide like this isn't worth it and leave. So what happens in abusive relationships, right, is that you have negative interactions, but then you have this occasional really positive interaction. And so, when I think about, and you probably have other examples too, like political rallies, right? When you come together and there's all of this sort of like adoration being thrown on you as like the chosen people, you've made the right decision, right? You're on the right side. And then of course you have like pork barrel spending, right? Where like somebody can say like, look what I did for you. And we see this like, like the signs that go up. I mean, the example this week of like the TSA video that is like blaming the Democrats for the government shutdown. But you also see this, like, we have like bridges that are like, there's signs that are like, built by like Governor Cuomo or whatever. And so I think politicians use these kinds of, they mimic reciprocity, right, by making it look like they're giving you something back. But it's always serving their own ends, right? It's not, I mean, some of the stuff is like there's bipartisan bills and stuff, but a lot of the stuff that we see is just literally like buying voters' love by giving them these little positive boosts in between all of the failures, like all the ways that they are not serving voter interests. And a lot of those are also much harder to see. Like it's harder to see what people aren't doing for you than it is to see what they are doing for you. And so I think that reinforces that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and it's like every 4 years you get a lot of attention, right? And that's going to carry you through 4 more years of having no voice at all. But the other piece of this that I think is important to understand is like there's this in-group and out-group dynamic that I talk about a lot. And that dynamic is really different from one-to-one relationships, right? Like there's a huge psychological literature about intergroup dynamics and intra-group dynamics, right? But the things that I also think is really powerful and not part of our conscious awareness that keeps us locked into the party is that if the party is your in-group, we have this unconscious program in the back of our heads that says, I get access to resources through my in-group. And there's a ton of research showing that you can get group membership behavior from like really minimal cues, right? So in the literature, they'll do this in a lab with like, I'll put blue stickers on one set of respondents and red stickers on the other, and then ask them to hand out resources in a game, like share money you've been given. This is a really classic psychology experiment. And people on the basis of a sticker on their shirt will give more resources to their own group. So of course it makes sense that, it takes very little reinforcement to get that group behavior, right? And so people stay with the parties because they believe, without necessarily being consciously aware of it, that that is their path to resources. And those can be financial resources, or they can be just access, right? Like the idea that like, this is the only way you have any access to power. So this is like, we talk about polarization and political dysfunction like it's all happening consciously and deliberately. And I think it's really important for people to also understand this in-group, out-group aspect because, here, say hello to my,
I'm waking up.
I'm being dog bombed. But yeah, people need to understand that there's also a non-conscious driver here that's incredibly powerful, and that's keeping us in those parties.
Well, and I think that does a nice job of showing like how all these things are tied together, right? It is like when we talk about the cycle of abuse, that word, like that term cycle is really meaningful because you have these cycles of the sort of each piece reinforces the next, right? And so polarization is a kind of a form of isolation, right? It makes gaslighting more powerful. And then once you've done that, right, you've activated this tribalism, and it makes it easier to both create fear of the other side, but also to create this resource, right, to sort of highlight this sense of I have to stick with my tribe because that's how I get access to resources. That's how I'm protected from these other people. And then you add in these periodic sort of positive reinforcements, right, like the love bombing, the positive messaging that you get for being part of this community. And so it really does kind of go through this cycle. And so it's really hard to disrupt those vicious cycles because they are mutually reinforcing, right? Each level reinforces the next. And that's partly why we're in this mess, right?
Yeah.
It's not
Right.
just that people can't envision a way out. Like, it's not like, we all know that third parties exist. We all know that, like, you can vote independent. We all know that you can split tickets and stuff like that. But the reason that this persists is because the mechanisms are self-sustaining. And so it's not like voters can, like, just like give up and try something new. And this was going to be my question for Lee Drutman in the last episode that we did, which was, I think he had this sort of vision for a kind of like federal works administration kind of reform. And that's like sort of saying, like, you have someone in an abusive relationship, and it's like saying, well, like, we're just going to like lift you and take you to some like couples therapy, like boot camp in the wilderness for 3 months, and we're going to fix your relationship. Well, okay, it's harder to do than that, like, right? And so breaking up these cycles, I think, is really, really hard. And I know that's a lot of the work that you do. I'm sort of trying to do it on the individual level by like helping people challenge binary thinking. But I do think that really what you need is this more systemic approach. And so that's partly what you guys are doing at the Independence Center, is really looking at like, how could we create some kind of systemic change? So that might lead us to the next question, which is like, how do we, if we're sort of stuck in this cycle, are there ways that we can disrupt the cycle? Or at least, like, what is boundary? Like, what do boundaries look like?
I was
Like,
going to say, like, I feel like this is just teeing up the idea of boundaries. And I think like both of our work has boundaries woven into it. So you could think about like boundaries and accountability, right? I found it really helpful. I hear Dr. Becky Good, her parenting advice makes it into my social media feeds, and it's really useful.
Mine too.
Yours too. And so one of the things she says is that like a boundary is something I will do, not something that you have to do. And I think about that's like been really helpful for parenting, and just being like, oh, no, there's a line here. But yeah, I think boundaries and accountability are the way that you get any relationship back on track, to the extent that it can be gotten back on track, right? Like, some relationships can't be fixed and you have to exit. And that's really like, we should believe people who tell us that that is where they have arrived. But if you're trying to course correct, I think, one of the boundaries that the Independence Center is working on is just getting people to vote differently, right? So one of the reasons that we think independents are really important for accountability is because partisans don't switch sides when their party doesn't behave in a way that they like, right? Because the other side is worse. So the people that you need in order to have some political accountability are the people who say like, well, no, you're going to have to convince me that your way is better. Like, you need to earn my vote. And that is what nonpartisans and independents do. And it's really important for the political system. And we have some other, an associated C4 and PAC that are actually looking for districts where they can run independents that voters can support, with the idea that like, this is how we will get politics to be responsive, is to bring in independents who neither side would have a majority in the House of Representatives under this strategy. And that would force this kind of coalition style government that would just be a really different dynamic than what we have right now. But the boundary is, if you aren't going to be responsive to my needs and what I tell you is my version of reality, I'm going to behave differently, and I'm going to give my political support to somebody who will. So that's the independent version of boundaries. But what is the radical moderate version of boundaries?
Well, so the Becky Good example, I love the way that she frames that, because it's actually like, I think, even more powerful than it looks at first glance, right? So, because I often see people talking about boundaries as things that they're going to enforce on other people. And I love how she's like, no. Like, a boundary isn't like you're going to stop doing this, right? It's, I'm not going to let you do X, Y, or Z, and I will remove myself or do X, Y, and Z if this continues, right?
Yeah.
Like, I will not pick up the phone if you call, or I will not, whatever. And this is really crucial for a theme that we talk about all the time, which is that if you're thinking about boundaries as something that you enforce on other people, right, that's keeping you in this control mentality, right? This idea that you can control other people. And when you realize you can't control other people, it leads to like deep frustration. It leads to frustration in the people that you're trying to control, but then it also leads to like deep frustration, demotivation on your part, right? Because like, guess what? You can't control what other people do. But when you think about boundaries as things that you, right, like these are actions that you will take. Now we're back in that realm of agency, right? Now we've given ourselves self-control. We've given ourselves a sense of agency over the political world. And I know that this is like a huge reason that a lot of Americans feel kind of just despair right now. I mean, I flip through Facebook and I just see all of these, I mean, Instagram, like whatever your social media platform of choice, people are feeling just like so demotivated because they don't feel like there's powerless that they can do. They feel powerless, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about boundaries as things that you do, not as things that you enforce on other people, I think is like absolutely crucial. One of the things that I emphasize, and this goes back to this question of agency, but it also links to the comment that you made about accountability, right? I think that the more that we stop thinking about policy issues in terms of these binaries, right? So like pro-life versus pro-choice, or Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, or like open borders versus closed borders, right? Like these are all really false binaries that actually obscure true solutions. And so when I try to get people to sort of think outside of the two-party box, one of the things that I ask them to do is like, let's actually get together and figure out what a solution, like, and I'm not talking like eradicating poverty or something, right? Like there's certain things that like, there's certain human challenges that will be with us always, but you can mitigate the harm that poverty does, right? You can like mitigate the harm that mental illness does. Like you can help vulnerable people in a variety of ways. And so when we think about those solutions are almost never zero sum, right? So zero sum is that like binary, like if you win, I lose, or if I win, you have to lose. Instead, we're thinking about these, like, what are these actual four-dimensional non-zero sum solutions, right? These things that like we can actually work on together. And I think you're absolutely right that those are much more likely to come from coalitions. I mean, they're just like, I think empirically, they're much more likely to come from coalitions than they are from this partisan back and forth that we have, right? But I think that when voters go to the polls, rejecting the idea that they should be asked to think in binary terms and instead ask their politicians, right, for true solutions. And you can be a one-party voter, right? This doesn't mean, a single issue voter. This doesn't mean that like you can't care really deeply about something. But chances are really good that if you want to solve that problem, you can't think about it in this deeply partisan way. So I'm reminded of our episode with Christina Dent, right? Where, she saw the harm that addiction did. She had this very specific, rigid view of addiction that was like ideological. And then she realized that, like, wait a second, there's actually like all of this complexity and nuance around addiction. And a lot of that came from personal interactions with people who are struggling with addiction. And so that kind of opened her eyes to the fact that we have these solutions that are, in fact, nonpartisan solutions to addiction, right? And they don't solve the root problem, but they definitely help mitigate the harm, and they help people find, a way forward. But you're not going to get there if you're stuck in this partisan binary box, right? And so, so to me, I think that's the way that I think about holding our politicians accountable is demanding actual solutions. Like, why haven't we figured out some kind of solution for the immigration crisis? Like, why haven't we figured out some sort of solution for homelessness, right? And this is something like largely democratic cities, right? We have serious problems with homelessness. There's lots of ways, like, again, to go back to our point from earlier, it's not like smart people haven't been working on these things. It's not like we don't have a plethora of things that we could try. We're just not trying them, right?
Yeah, because they are more valuable as political volleyballs than they are solved. We've seen this with abortion. We see it with immigration, entitlement reform. all of these things, right? And those you could actually like if you look at all of those examples, they're very tied to fear, right? Because it's like
Mhm.
fear over either somebody's harming unborn children or somebody's going to harm women and their ability to direct their own medical care, right? Like same with
Yep.
immigration, like the dangers of immigration, right? Or the harm suffered by refugees. Entitlement reform, right? Like we're going to let elderly people starve or we're going to let the system run out, right? So like there's fear woven into all of those. The issues that are hugely important and don't have a fear-based component to them, you don't hear about, right? Like
Yep.
infrastructure, um,
Yep.
every once in a while when a bridge collapses, I think that makes its way, that issue bubbles back up, right? But like it's
Mhm.
not top of mind because there's not a strong fear-based message to bring out to it, right?
Mhm.
But I think if you are somebody who cares deeply about any of those issues, you would be amenable to a lot of potential solutions, right? And there are a lot of approaches that you could take to those things, and they're nuanced. They require an on the ground understanding of what the real problem is, right? And like what it looks like on the ground. Um, and when you have that, you start to think about the issue in a really different way and just have different expectations for how your elected official should be navigating it. But I do think that this is where the two-party system, the winner take all system, sort of very conveniently like keeps these policy issues in a space where they are more valuable unsolved than they are saying to voters like you're right, immigration is complicated and there are a lot of reasons to get a handle on it, and that's something we are entirely capable of doing entirely. And this
Yeah.
country has solved really thorny policy issues many times in the past, and we can do it again. But we're going to have to we're going to have to get out of the abusive relationship. We're going to have to like set some boundaries and reclaim our power. I think that like that
Yep.
is, I think that comes up in parenting. It comes up in the way you and I talk about politics and being a citizen in this podcast, right? Which is like, it all starts with a sense of agency and like who I am, what I want, this self connection, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So because we're coming up to the end, I think we have probably about 10 minutes left. I did want to just anyone who wants to ask us questions or if we've missed anything, like have we
Yeah.
missed any elements of an abusive relationship that we see in politics that we haven't talked about? So like please drop those in the comments. We would love to hear from you. Um, Another element that I wanted to mention, just because it came up on LinkedIn this morning, to go back, we'd mentioned Amanda Ripley's work. Um, she had a nice sort of a post this morning, or I don't know, it's LinkedIn, so it could have been 2 months
Who knows?
ago. I don't know when the algorithm popped up, but looking at why the media or how the media contributes to this, right?
Mhm.
So the media does the same kind of thing, right? And so a lot of it has to do with, algorithms, but it also has to do with the fact that fear drives human behavior, right?
Mhm.
We have this negativity bias. We're much more interested in true crime than we are
Mhm.
in like really positive stories of I'm as guilty of this as anyone else. And so, one of the goals of her work, both in good conflict, but also the conversations and contributions that she's made to the solutions journalism framework,
Mhm.
right, is to try to highlight exactly this kind of like, these are the people who are coming up with solutions. These are the people who are tackling really complicated, kind of wicked problems in their communities and solving them. And so
Mhm.
that does a couple things. One, it helps erode the negativity bias, right? Like you actually start seeing more of the stuff in your feed, right? Like if the New York Times ran more articles about positive things and solutions and less about how the world is burning down, right? Like that would change the way that people think about
Mhm.
their lives, right? So I think it does that. But then it also helps those ideas spread. I mean, one of the problems that like you and I both struggle with is that like a lot of the work that we do is really bottom up. We're really
Mhm.
focused on individual level change or like small kind of scale change. And it's really hard for those. And a lot of the people that I really respect the most are doing that kind of like, Seth Kaplan's
Mhm.
work on fragile neighborhoods.
Mhm.
So all of that stuff is amazing, but it's really hard to scale.
Mhm.
But one of the things that we could take advantage of, right, is the sort of power of algorithms to spread like
if we had media that was more focused on solutions and then trying to get those stories picked up.
Mhm.
Um, and so that gives people ideas. It gives them things to try out. I remember
Mhm.
reading something on like police reform that was just looking at like how, and this is true, by the way, of large institutions across the board. It affects the work that I do in healthcare policy too.
Mhm.
If you look at the way that physicians, for example, practice medicine, it's more heavily influenced by the practice patterns at their local hospital than
Mhm.
it is by broad, like what's actually best in the medical literature. And
Mhm.
that's just human nature, right?
Mhm.
We adapt to the norms of our local environment. And so
Mhm.
the same thing is true of police forces. The same thing is
Right.
true of like all of these kinds of places where humans work together and where norms affect the way that they behave. And so one of the things too that I think a solutions journalism framework and the kind of work that you're doing helps people do, it helps people break out of like, oh wait, they're actually someone has
Mhm.
tried something. Let's see, maybe it won't be a good fit for my whatever, my
Mhm.
university or my healthcare system. But maybe it will be, right?
Mhm.
And so if you know that people are trying things and succeeding, that helps you get out of this rut that we're sometimes in of like, well, this is just the way it is, right?
Right.
And we have all these failures, but that's just life, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think media plays a really important role too, and we haven't touched on
Absolutely.
that yet much, but
Yeah, absolutely.
um, well, so I think we should close with our weekly optimism. We I think we've uncovered a lot of unhealthy patterns. You're kind of touching on some more positive directions. Um, but yeah, let's wrap it up with something more positive. Yeah. There was actually one thing that we did miss, and I'll make this
Mhm.
my positive.
Okay.
You know, one of the sort of signs of an abusive relationship is feeling like you're walking on eggshells, and I think we
Mhm.
see this in the political realm when it comes to people feeling uncomfortable challenging their
Mhm.
party's position on anything, right? Like the idea is like I can't challenge our position on this because then the other side wins, right? Like we're stuck in this kind of tribal mentality. Um, and similarly, people are really they're uncomfortable speaking up in sort of broader spaces about politics because it's gotten so
Mhm.
ugly. And so I think we like people are sort of walking on eggshells in really complicated ways, except for on like anonymous comment,
Mhm.
comment sections on the internet where everyone
Yeah.
feels free to just be as outrageous and
Their
awful as
worst selves.
their absolute worst self. But one of the things that I've been feeling sort of optimistic about is the feedback, and this is sort of it's a pat on my back, but I don't mean that in that sense. Um, I've heard from a bunch of people that just having spaces where like people are proclaiming moderate views. And there's like a
Mhm.
number of people on Substack, for example, doing really good work in
Mhm.
how to have complicated conversations, how to have nuanced conversations. There's a lot of people doing really powerful work and like constructive dialogue. And what I love about about those different spaces that people are trying to engage across differences is the fact that like people come out of it feeling transformed. Like they feel like that is a way that you can break
Mhm.
this cycle of abuse, right? And so people come out of it saying like, wow, maybe they're not, throwing their like Democrat or Republican card in the trash, but they actually do feel as though they have a sense of agency. They feel like they
Mhm.
now have an ability to at least break free from the fear cycle.
Mhm.
And I think there's more now, to be fair, this could just be the fact that like the algorithm feeds me stuff that I want to
Mhm.
see. But looking at like my LinkedIn feed and my, my Substack feed, like I think there's a lot more people out there making visible
Mhm.
and clear contributions to like let's tone down the vitriol in our politics and let's actually start trying to look for real solutions. And we got to do it together, right? So that
Mhm.
means like I've got to learn to talk to people who disagree with me and vice versa. So I'm feeling hopeful about it. I know it's hard to feel. I mean, there's a lot to be concerned about, so I don't
Mhm.
wanna dismiss what's happening out in the broader political space, but I do think on the civil society level, we're actually doing okay. So I feel
Yeah,
good
like
about
some
that.
progress. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny that you said said that they feel transformed by this, because what you made me think is that, like, when you're actually locked into this tribal dynamic or the in-group out-group dynamic, right? Like, that is a very old part of our brains, and it relies on dehumanization. And you actually, I would make the case that you dehumanizing other people is also dehumanizing yourself. You like step into this dynamic where the other person is not fully human, not deserving of fully human treatment, and you become a person who treats other people in that way, right? And like, that's really damaging and destructive. And
Yeah.
so, like, I think we get sucked into it, or we can be sucked into it, like, without being fully aware of it. But if you can stop, I think the transformative nature of that interaction is addictive almost, right? Like, you don't want to go back to dehumanization once you have seen the difference between those two modes, because I think most people would rather be their fully human self. And we don't live, this is not 20,000 years ago, or even like 1,000 years ago, right? Where human survival is so precarious. Like, we have a lot of resources. We had Andrew Heaton on, who did like the most wonderful unpacking of reasons to be optimistic.
Yeah.
Modern life has transformed the opportunities that are available to individuals. So, like, we don't need to live in this ancient tribal way of thinking. We have so much like abundance available to us. And I think we give that back to people by saying, hey, you actually have the power, right? Like, I trust you to figure this out. I don't support you figuring it out, and I also trust you to figure this out. So I think all of that is really positive and really hopeful, and I'm seeing the same thing. So co-signed.
Well, and so this goes back to just sort of the theme, which is, I loved your point about tribalism, and 60,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, right? Tribes did really positive things for people, right? They helped support them, right? They helped raise children. They protected people from, aggression and wild animals and stuff. So this isn't to say that like the tribalistic instinct is like totally crazy, right?
Right.
But I think your point is like, let's figure out who your tribe actually is, right? Like, there's
That's a great
tribes
point.
that reinforce the humanity of other people and help you become a better person, a fuller person. And then there's tribes that rely entirely on dehumanization. And that is, I think, the toxicity that we're seeing with the current political parties and the current system sort of across the board. So choose your tribes wisely. That might be
that's a great tagline. I love that.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This was super fun. All right. Bye, everyone. You've been listening to We Made This Political with Laura Forkham and Lauren Hall. You can find us on Substack, Instagram, or LinkedIn. The podcast Substack is We Made This Political. Laura's Substack is How to Human, and Lauren's Substack is The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. Subscribe and share if you like what you hear, and please also rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. That really, really helps other people find our work and means a lot to us too. Thanks for listening.